The stagecoach lies on its side, a broken beast against the ochre dust, one wheel still spinning lazily, mockingly. Dust, thick as wool, chokes the air, tasting of splintered pine and something metallic, like fear. He reins in his gelding, a low grunt escaping him as he surveys the carnage. Scattered trunks, a woman's bonnet trampled into the dirt, the distant, fading hoofbeats of what he figures were probably road agents. Then, a sound, small and lost beneath the groan of stressed wood, a whimper. Alias Thorne dismounts, rifle still in its scabbard but his hand instinctively near his colt. He moves carefully around the wreckage, his worn boots kicking aside a shattered lantern. Beneath the canted body of the coach, pinned by a heavy valise and a section of the splintered doorframe, he sees a swatch of dark fabric, then a hand, slender and pale, fingers twitching. She's alive. He works with a grim sort of efficiency, the kind born of long years alone in a land that offers little quarter. The valise is heavy, full of books by the feel of it. He levers it away, then tackles the doorframe, his muscles straining. Finally, he pulls her free, cradling her for a moment. Her face is smudged with dirt and a trickle of blood from a cut on her temple, dark hair splayed around her like a storm-tossed halo. Her eyes flutter open, dazed, the blue of a washed-out sky after a downpour. They fix on his face, unfocused. What? Where am I? She breathes, her voice raspy. Stagecoach wreck, he says, his own voice rough from disuse. Can you tell me your name? She frowns, a small, painful motion. I don't know. I can't remember. Her gaze searches his, desperate, but beneath the claimed emptiness, something else flickers. A deep, knowing shadow, like a briefly glimpsed reflection in a dark pool. It's gone as quickly as it appears, replaced by a raw, convincing terror, but he saw it. This woman, claiming no past, carries a history in the depths of her eyes, a secret she's already determined to guard. There's more to this woman than meets the eye. Before her true past or secret comes to light, tell us, have you ever misjudged someone only to be surprised? And if you love a story of hidden depths, hit like and subscribe. The sun beat down, merciless. The silence, now that the coach had settled into its final broken rest, was profound, broken only by the buzz of flies already gathering. There were no other survivors immediately visible, though he'd make a thorough search. He could see the tracks of at least 4 horses heading east, fast. Bandits most likely, though they'd left this one. Perhaps they thought her dead, or simply weren't interested in a lone woman after they'd looted the strongbox, if there was one. He gently probed her temple. You've got a nasty cut, might be a concussion. Anything else hurt? She shook her head, then winced. My head, everything's foggy. He offered her his canteen, and she drank, her eyes never leaving his, still holding that faint, unsettling undercurrent. He couldn't just leave her here. The nearest town, such as it was a good day's ride, and she was in no condition to travel that far unsupported. His own cabin was closer, a half day if he pushed it. I'll take you to my place, he stated, more than offered. It's rough, but you can rest there. She just nodded, a flicker of something unreadable, relief, resignation. In those secret-keeping eyes before she sagged against him, a fragile weight. And with that unspoken agreement, a burden and a mystery settled onto Alias Thorne's solitary life. The journey to his cabin had been slow, punctuated by her moments of dizziness and his own terse questions, which yielded nothing but reiterations of her blank memory. He'd fashioned a makeshift travois, padding it with his bedroll, not wanting to risk her falling from his horse. She'd called herself Jane when he pressed for something, anything to call her by, a name as blank as the past she claimed. He, Alias Thorne, was a man accustomed to the stark realities of the Wyoming territory. His ranch was small, scratched out of a stubborn valley nestled between harsh, unforgiving hills. Solitude had been his companion for so long it felt like a second skin. He'd buried a wife and son years ago, victims of a fever that swept through their first homestead, and the silence they'd left behind had become his norm. He spoke little because there was often no one to speak to, and he thought much because the land gave a man ample time for contemplation. When they finally reached the small, sturdy log cabin, dusk was painting the sky in bruised purples and reds. He carried her inside, laying her gently on the narrow cot that served as his bed. The cabin was Spartan, a stone fireplace, a rough-hewn table and 2 chairs, a shelf with a few worn books and tin plates. It was clean, though, and smelled faintly of wood smoke and coffee. She looked around, her eyes, those vivid, secretive eyes, taking in the meager surroundings. "Thank you," she whispered, her gaze returning to his face. It was the first time he'd heard a genuine note of warmth in her voice, unclouded by fear or that strange, watchful opacity. He made a quick search of the wreck site the next morning, leaving her resting. There were 2 other bodies, the driver and a portly man who looked like a merchant. He buried them shallowly, marking the graves with rough crosses of broken wood. He found her reticule, a small, beaded thing, mostly empty save for a few coins, and a handkerchief embroidered with a delicate, unfamiliar flower, no initials. The bandits had been thorough. The stage line would eventually send someone, but in this vast territory, eventually could mean weeks. He returned to find her awake, sitting on the edge of the cot, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She looked small and lost against the backdrop of his rough-hewn life. He cleaned and dressed the cut on her temple again. It was healing, but the bruise beneath was stark against her pale skin. "Any better?" he asked, his voice gruff to cover an unaccustomed awkwardness. She shook her head. "It's all, just a blank, like a slate wiped clean." But her eyes, when she said it, didn't quite match the words. There was a tension in her, a coiled watchfulness that belied the image of a helpless amnesiac. He didn't call her on it, not yet. He had his own secrets, his own griefs, locked away. Who was he to demand hers? The first few days passed in a quiet, strained routine. He went about his ranch chores, mending fences, checking on his small herd of cattle, chopping wood. She stayed mostly inside, listless at first, then slowly beginning to move about the cabin, tidying things that were already tidy, her movements hesitant but strangely graceful. He noticed she flinched at loud noises, the sharp crack of his axe, a coyote's howl in the distance, and her sleep was troubled. He'd hear her murmur, sometimes cry out softly, but when he'd ask in the morning, she'd claim not to remember any dreams. The nearest settlement, a dusty collection of buildings called Redemption, was where Elias traded his occasional surplus calf or bought meager supplies. He knew he should report the wreck, report her presence. But a strange reluctance held him back. If her amnesia was real, sending her to Redemption would mean sending her to the care of strangers, perhaps the disinterested county sheriff who'd see her as a burden. If it wasn't real, then she had reasons for her silence, reasons that might put her in danger if he broadcast her whereabouts. He found himself watching her, not with suspicion, but with a growing curiosity, a protectiveness that felt foreign and yet deeply familiar, stirring embers he'd thought long dead. One afternoon, he came in from the south pasture, hot and tired, to find her humming softly as she swept the already clean dirt floor. It was a simple, almost mournful tune he didn't recognize. She stopped abruptly when she saw him, color flooding her cheeks. I don't know where that came from," she stammered, her eyes wide and, for a moment, genuinely frightened. "It was pretty," he said, simply, and watched the fear recede, replaced by that careful blankness. Later that week, he rode into Redemption. He reported the wreck to Marshal Davies, a stoic man who'd seen too much to be easily surprised. "Any survivors?" Davies asked, whittling a piece of wood. "One, a woman. Got a knock on the head, says she can't remember who she is." Davies spat. "Amnesia, eh? Convenient. Anything missing from the coach, strongbox?" "Didn't see one. Bandits took what they wanted, I reckon. Left her for dead." The marshal's gaze was shrewd. "You keeping her out at your place, Thorne?" Elias met his gaze squarely. "She's injured. Nowhere else for her to go right now. Just see she ain't trouble." Davies said, not unkindly, "We got enough of that." As Elias left the marshal's office, he saw a newcomer in town, a man in a city suit that looked out of place, asking quiet questions at the general store, his eyes sharp and assessing. Elias felt a prickle of unease. The man didn't look like a stage line official. He looked like a hunter. Back at the cabin, the tension ratcheted up, unspoken but palpable. Jane, as he still called her, seemed more restless. One evening, A storm blew in, the wind howling like a banshee, rain lashing against the single window. A particularly violent clap of thunder made her cry out and drop the tin plate she was drying. It clattered loudly on the floor. She stood frozen, her face pale, her eyes wide with a terror that was far too specific for general amnesia. "It's just thunder," he said, his voice calm. She didn't seem to hear him. She was staring at the door, as if expecting something monstrous to break it down. "They'll find me," she whispered, so low he almost didn't catch it. "They'll find me." He moved closer. "Who will find you, Jane?" Her eyes focused on him, sharp with an agony of indecision. For a moment, he thought she would speak, truly speak. Then, the mask slammed back down. I don't know. The storm, it frightens me." He didn't push. He picked up the plate, his heart heavy. The secret she carried was a heavy one, heavy enough to terrify her into this elaborate charade. And he was beginning to fear that whatever it was drawing closer. A few days later, while mending a bridle on the porch, he saw her near the small creek that ran by the cabin. She was sketching in the dirt with a stick, her brow furrowed in concentration. Curious, he ambled closer. It wasn't random scribbles. It was a face, a man's face, harsh-featured, with a cruel twist to the mouth. She saw him approach and quickly scuffed it out with her foot, her expression guilty. "Who was that?" he asked, keeping his tone mild. "No one. Just doodling," but her hand trembled slightly. That night, she woke screaming, a name on her lips, Julian, followed by a choked sob. He was by her side in an instant, his hand on her shoulder. "Easy now, you're safe." She stared up at him, her eyes wild with remembered fear, the carefully constructed amnesia shattered by the nightmare. He said he'd kill me if I ever." She broke off, clamping her mouth shut, the realization of what she'd said dawning in her eyes. Elias sat on the edge of her cot. The cabin was dark, the fire long dead, only the faint moonlight filtering through the window. "Julian?" he prompted gently. "Is that who you're afraid of?" She turned her face away, silent, but he could see the tremor that ran through her. He didn't press further that night, but the name hung in the air between them, a piece of the puzzle she could no longer deny existed. He found himself thinking of the man in the city suit in Redemption, the quiet questions, the assessing eyes. Was he looking for a woman named Jane, or someone else entirely, someone Julian wanted found? The next day, Elias decided to ride out further than usual, checking snares he'd set for rabbits. As he crested a ridge overlooking the main trail to Redemption, a trail he usually avoided, he saw two riders. One was the man in the city suit. The other was a harder-looking sort, with a gun belt slung low and mean eyes. They were questioning a homesteader, pointing back in the general direction of Elias's valley. His blood ran cold. They were searching methodically, and they were getting closer. He rode back to the cabin hard, his mind racing. He found her outside, by the woodpile, her expression distant. "We need to talk," he said, his voice grim. "Those men I saw in town, they're out this way, and I think they're looking for you." Her face went ash-white. The pretense of amnesia evaporated like mist in the sun, leaving behind stark, undiluted fear. How do you know?" "I saw them. They're asking questions. And last night, you called out a name, Julian." She sank onto the chopping block, her head in her hands. "Oh God," she whispered. He squatted down in front of her. "It's time you told me the truth, Lila." He'd started calling her that a few days ago, a softer name than Jane, one that seemed to fit the glimpses of the real woman he'd seen. She'd accepted it without comment. "I can't help you if I don't know what we're up against." Her shoulders shook. When she finally looked up, her eyes were filled with a desperation that tore at him. "My real name is Serafina," she said, her voice barely audible. "Serafina Dubois, and Julian is my husband." The word husband hit Elias like a physical blow, a cold knot forming in his stomach. He hadn't allowed himself to think about the nature of his growing feelings for her, but the sudden, sharp pang of something akin to jealousy was undeniable. "He's a monster," Serafina continued, her voice trembling with a mixture of fear and fury. "Wealthy, powerful, and cruel. He delights in control, in pain." Her gaze dropped. I was a bird in a gilded cage, Elias. He paraded me like a possession, but in private. She shuddered. I had to escape. I took some jewelry, enough to get me far away, start a new life. I was on my way to California. The amnesia, it was a lie. I was so terrified when I woke up in that wreck, I didn't know who I could trust. It seemed like the only way to buy myself some time. The men? Elias prompted. Pinkertons, most likely. Julian would spare no expense to find me. He wouldn't just want the jewelry back. He'd want me, to make an example of me. Her eyes pleaded with him. He'll kill me if he finds me, Elias. Or worse. Elias stood, his jaw tight. He looked out towards the hills, in the direction he'd seen the riders. They were coming. He had little doubt of that. He could tell her to run, to try and make it on her own. Or he could send her to Marshal Davies, though he doubted Davies had the resources or the inclination to stand against hired guns working for a rich man. His gaze returned to Serafina. She was watching him, her face a mask of terrified hope. He saw not the deceitful amnesiac, but a desperate woman fighting for her life. He thought of his own lost wife, of the helplessness he'd felt against the fever. This was different. This was a fight he could choose. All right, Serafina, he said, his voice quiet but firm. We'll face them, together. A tear spilled from her eye, tracing a path through the dust on her cheek. You believe me? I believe what I see in your eyes, he said, and I see a woman worth fighting for. He didn't analyze the words, didn't question the depth of feeling behind them. There wasn't time. They'll likely reach here by morning if they're thorough. We need to prepare. The night was taut with anticipation. Serafina, her fear now channeled into a desperate energy, told him more about Julian, his connections, his vindictiveness, the subtle ways he'd isolated her until she felt she had no one. Elias listened, his anger, a cold, steady burn. He cleaned his rifle and his Colt, checked his ammunition. He had no illusions about his chances against two professional manhunters, possibly more if they had backup. But his small valley was defensible, if one knew the land, and he knew it like the back of his hand. He showed Serafina how to load the spare shotgun, his hands briefly covering hers. Her skin was cold. Stay inside, by the window. If they get past me, don't hesitate. She nodded, her eyes dark and wide. Elias, if something happens to you. Nothing's going to happen, he said, with more conviction than he felt. Get some rest, or try to. Neither of them slept. They sat in the dim light of a single lamp, the silence punctuated by the chirping of crickets and the distant howl of a lone wolf, a sound that usually brought him a sense of peace, but now seemed ominous. He found himself watching her, the way the lamplight caught the curve of her cheek, the strength in her delicate jaw. She was no longer just a survivor of a wreck, a woman with a secret. She was Serafina, and her fight had become his. Just before dawn, he positioned himself in the rocks overlooking the narrow entrance to his valley. The mist was thick, clinging to the ground, sound muffled. He waited. Hours passed. The sun began to burn off the mist, and then he heard it, the jingle of harness, the low murmur of voices. Two riders emerged from the thinning fog. The man in the city suit, looking rumpled and ill-tempered, and the harder man, his eyes constantly scanning. Elias let them ride further into the valley, closer to the cabin, before he stepped out from the rocks, his rifle held ready, but not aimed. That's far enough, his voice rang out, clear and steady. The riders pulled up sharply, hands instinctively going to their weapons. Who the hell are you? The hard man, whose name Elias would later learn was Cully, snarled. Name's Thorne. This is my land. State your business. The man in the suit, Mr. Grice, as he introduced himself, took over, his voice smoother, but with an underlying arrogance. We're looking for a woman, Mr. Thorne. Serafina Dubois. She may be going by another name. Dark hair, blue eyes, absconded with property belonging to her husband, Mr. Julian Dubois, a very influential man. Don't know any woman by that name, Elias said, his face impassive. Grice's eyes narrowed. We have reason to believe she came this way. There was a stagecoach wreck. Perhaps you found her? Found a wreck. Buried the dead. No woman like you describe. Elias kept his gaze steady, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. Cully shifted in his saddle. Maybe we should just have a look in that cabin of yours, farmer. This is private property, Elias said, his voice hardening. You don't have a warrant to search it, and you're not welcome here. Grice smiled, a thin, unpleasant expression. Mr. Thorne, we can do this the easy way, or the hard way. Mr. Dubois is offering a substantial reward for her return. And he's not a patient man. I told you, Elias said, his thumb resting near the hammer of his rifle. She's not here. It was a standoff. The air crackled with tension. Elias knew that if they called his bluff, if they pushed past him, Serafina was inside, alone with the shotgun. He could see the cabin door from his vantage point. It remained closed. Then, the cabin door opened. Serafina stepped out onto the porch, the shotgun held loosely in her hands, but her stance was resolute. Her eyes, no longer hiding, met Grice's. I am Serafina Dubois, she said, her voice surprisingly strong, carrying in the still morning air. But I am not stolen property. I fled a man who treated me with cruelty you cannot imagine. Grice's smirk widened. Ah, so the farmer is a liar as well as a harborer of thieves. Mrs. Dubois, your husband is merely concerned for your welfare. Concerned. Serafina laughed, a bitter, brittle sound. Julian is concerned with possession, Mr. Grice, not welfare. The only thing he wants is to see me punished for daring to seek my freedom. Elias watched Grice and Cully. Their attention was now split. Cully looked eager for violence, but Grice seemed to be reassessing. A lone woman, even with a shotgun, was one thing. A determined rancher who knew the terrain, and a woman now speaking with defiance, was another. This is a domestic dispute, Thorne, Grice said, turning his attention back to Elias. No concern of yours. Hand her over, and we'll forget your interference. What happens between a husband and wife is their business, Elias said slowly, up to a point. But what I see here is two hired men threatening an unarmed woman on my land. And that is my concern. He took a small step forward. I suggest you gentlemen turn around and ride out the way you came. Cully's hand twitched towards his gun. You think you can stop us, old man? Before Elias could answer, a new voice cut in, sharp and authoritative. Hold it right there, Cully. All heads turned. Marshal Davies rode into view, a deputy flanking him. He must have followed Elias's tracks from town, or perhaps the homesteader the Pinkertons questioned had sent word. Davies, Grice said, his tone venomous. This doesn't concern you. Threatening folks on their own land, brandishing weapons. Sounds like it concerns me just fine, Grice. Davies said, his gaze hard. I know your reputation. Pinkertons, are you? Or just glorified bounty hunters for a rich bully? Serafina spoke again, her voice clear and unwavering. Marshal, my husband, Julian Dubois of Philadelphia, is a cruel and abusive man. I fled for my life. These men are hired to drag me back to him. I haven't broken any law worthy of this pursuit. Davies looked from Serafina to Grice. Mr. Grice, do you have a warrant for this woman's arrest for a crime committed in this territory? Grice hesitated. She absconded with valuable property. Jewelry, Marshal, Serafina interjected. Wedding gifts, things he showered me with when he wasn't. She faltered, then straightened. Things I took to survive. Davies nodded slowly. Sounds like a civil matter back east, Grice. Not something for armed pursuit across state lines without proper authority. Unless you can show me a federal warrant or evidence of a felony committed here, I suggest you take Mr. Thorne's advice and move along. Cully looked ready to explode, but Grice, ever the pragmatist, seemed to deflate. He knew when he was beaten, especially with a marshal and a deputy now evening the odds, and Thorne still looking like he was ready to use that rifle. This isn't over, Mrs. Dubois, Grice said, his eyes cold as he looked at Serafina. Julian always gets what he wants. Not this time, Serafina said, her chin high. Grice sneered, then jerked his head at Cully. They turned their horses, albeit reluctantly, and rode out of the valley, the marshal and his deputy watching them go until they were out of sight. Silence descended, broken only by the chirping of a brave bird. Serafina slowly lowered the shotgun, her hands trembling. Elias walked towards her, his own rifle now pointing at the ground. He stopped before her on the porch, his gaze searching hers. The fear was still there, but beneath it, a new light was dawning, relief and a fierce, defiant strength. You stood up to them, he said, his voice hoarse. We stood up to them, she corrected softly. Marshal Davies rode up, dismounting. Mrs. Dubois, he said, his tone respectful. You all right? Yes, Marshal, thank you. Thorne, Davies said, nodding at Elias. Good man, stubborn as a mule, but good. He looked back at Serafina. Those types, they might try again, or send others. But word will get around you got friends now, and the law in redemption isn't keen on bullies, no matter how rich. He paused. If you want to press charges for their threats, I'll take your statement. Serafina looked at Elias, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. Yes, Marshal, she said, I would. As the Marshal took down her statement, Elias leaned against the porch rail, the tension slowly ebbing from his shoulders. The sun was higher now, warming the valley, chasing away the last of the morning mist. It felt like more than just the day had brightened. After Marshal Davies and his deputy departed, promising to keep an eye out and to wire an inquiry about Julian Dubois to counterparts further east, a profound quiet settled over the cabin. Serafina sank onto the porch steps, the shotgun resting beside her. Elias sat down next to her, not too close, but near enough that she could feel his presence, a steady anchor in the turbulent wake of the confrontation. For a long time neither spoke. The sounds of the valley reasserted themselves, the gentle murmur of the creek, the rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods, the distant lowing of one of Elias's cows. It was a peaceful sound, a sound of normalcy that felt almost jarring after the morning's tension. Finally, Serafina let out a long, shuddering breath. It's over, for now, at least. For now, Elias agreed. He knew men like Julian Dubois didn't give up easily, but they had won this battle. She had won it, by finding her voice. She turned to him, her blue eyes, now clear of the haunted shadows and the feigned emptiness, were filled with an emotion that made his chest tighten. Elias, she began, her voice thick. There are no words to thank you. You risked everything for me. A stranger, a liar. He shook his head. You weren't a stranger for long, Serafina, and you lied because you were scared. I understand scared. He thought of his own past, the fears he'd lived with. What Julian Dubois did to you, no one deserves that. A comfortable silence fell between them again, less strained this time, imbued with a shared understanding. The secret that had stood between them like a wall was gone, and in its place, something new and fragile, yet surprisingly strong, was beginning to grow. What will you do now? He asked gently. She looked out at the valley, at the rugged hills that cradled it. I don't know. California still seems a long way off. And I don't have much to start over with. She glanced at him, a small, hesitant smile touching her lips. You once called me Lila. It seemed to suit you, he said, a faint warmth spreading through him. I like it, she said softly. Maybe Lila can find a place here, if she's welcome. Elias looked at her, truly looked at her, at the resilience that had brought her through so much, at the courage she had shown, at the quiet beauty that even hardship couldn't entirely dim. His solitary life, once a refuge, now felt empty without her presence in it. This valley can be a hard place, he said, his voice a low rumble. But it's peaceful, and there's always work for willing hands. He paused, then met her gaze directly. You're welcome here, Lila, for as long as you want to stay. Her smile widened, and this time it reached her eyes, chasing away the last of the shadows. It was like seeing the sun break through after a long storm. Thank you, Elias. He merely nodded, but a sense of rightness, of a profound shift in the bedrock of his life, settled over him. He had rescued a woman from a stagecoach wreck, a woman whose eyes held a secret. Now the secret was out, but in its place he sensed a promise, the promise of companionship, of shared burdens, and perhaps in time something more. He rose and offered her his hand. Come on, he said. I reckon we both could use some coffee. She placed her hand in his, her grip surprisingly firm. As they walked into the small, familiar cabin, it no longer felt like just his shelter. It felt like a home, ready to embrace a new beginning, a shared future forged in the crucible of danger and trust. The land outside was vast and often indifferent, but within these rough log walls, a quiet kind of hope had taken root, resilient and determined, much like the two souls who now stood together within it. The sun climbs higher, casting long shadows from the porch posts. Inside the cabin, two figures move with a newfound ease, the aroma of coffee beginning to fill the small space. He watches her as she measures out the grounds, a small, contented hum escaping her lips, the haunted look that once clung to her now replaced by a quiet, resilient peace. Her past is not erased, but it no longer defines her. Her eyes, once holding a desperate secret, now reflect the warm light of the cabin, and perhaps a flicker of hope for the future they might build together, here in this rugged, unexpected sanctuary. He rescued a woman, and in doing so, perhaps rescued a part of himself he thought long lost. Thanks for watching. If you believe in compassion overcoming prejudice and finding love in unexpected places, give this story a like and subscribe for more. This story showed love and heroism where least expected. What was your favorite moment of connection between them? Tell us in the comments.